Hello, Michelle. Welcome
Hi.
to the podcast.
Hi, Greg. It's lovely to be here, and I loved your first episode. I listened to it while I was driving, and loved the examples you shared and the tone of it. Thank you so much, and congratulations on getting started.
Thank you. And when I was thinking about having my first guest, no one else that came to mind apart from you. You were really instrumental in, I think, my professional development, and I think that's something. Let's talk about that. But I remember back in 2018, I moved from a more site-based sort of operational training role into my first corporate L&D role, and around that time, that was when you started the podcast, I think. And so I
It
think
was 2018.
so I found it really early on, and I still remember I didn't really have, and I think I mentioned this in the first episode, I didn't really have much of a professional network because I was sort of, I'd say out in a mine site in isolation a little bit. And I think I still was grappling, like, am I an L&D professional type thing, in the role I was in. So moving to Brisbane, getting the role I did, and then sort of, I hadn't really had anyone to be able to, I'll say, mentor me or sort of show me what good looked like in a lot of ways. And I remember finding your podcast, and that was huge for me. But then I remember you came and visited the office that I was working in 2018, and you were just really willing to just give your time. We had really interesting chat about L&D, and yeah, that was I think opened up just a lot of other network connections to me through the podcast. Then connected with so many other people you've had on, and examples they've shared. So yeah, it's been really huge. So I thought that was a good place to start with you on for my first guest.
Thank you so much. And for me, that the podcast, and I know we're going to talk a bit about, you asked me, what do I want to talk about? And I really had to think about it. And it struck me as I was gardening on the weekend that, one of the things that's really important to me is connection, community, collaboration, and that I've had to go through my own journey with that. And it has transformed my own approach, my own professional development, my own career path. And I think there's a real power in it. The podcast, I mean, it was birthed out of connection, right? And I can show you a quick story, a quick example of that. But it's a great way to be able to reach out, for me, to anyone in L&D anywhere in the world. And basically, if I can connect to them, if they're willing to talk, have a conversation about their work. So it's one of the key ways I continue to keep abreast of what are people actually doing in the real world, and what impact is that having, what challenges are they having, how are they addressing those. But I never would have started the podcast on my own. It felt really daunting. But you see, the thing about L&D, and I think your story just exemplifies that, Greg, the example you just gave, it's not just a profession, it's a community, and people are very willing to share, to connect with each other, to lean into experiences and trading experiences to learn from each other. And the way the podcast started was back in November 2017. I was sitting at the Australian Institute of Training and Development Awards dinner at Pyrmont, and it was right on Sydney Harbour. It was just a beautiful venue, the water sparkling outside, people, happy to be there celebrating the recognition of their work in learning and development as teams. And I was sitting next to Karen Maloney, who I didn't know very well at that time. And she told me she was thinking about starting a podcast. Now, this had been on my bucket list for about 3 or 4 years, but I was really daunted about the idea of doing it alone, and I just didn't know where to start. The other thing was, and a little bit of a confession here, I wanted the glamour of being the host without the tedium of doing the editing. So Karen said to me she'd been talking to Amanda Ashby, who was also an AATD member, who was keen to be our editor. And Amanda had a full-time job, still has a full-time job in learning and development, but she wanted to build the editing skills. So the three of us launched the Learning Uncut podcast in June. I've been running it solo since early 2020, but it took a collaboration and a connection at a community event for me to come together with Karen and Amanda to move it off my bucket list and into the real world. I think for me, the podcast at its heart is born of connection and community, and is a celebration on an ongoing basis of connection and community in L&D.
Now that you mentioned that, I do remember your early on episodes. There was not just you involved, but yeah, that was the first time I actually remembered that. And I'm the same, right? I find since I started in this that I've always been blown away by how much people are willing to share.
Yeah.
Even in the last few weeks, reaching out to people, talking about what they're doing, and they mention a piece of work they've done. Carolyn Pether, which is someone that I connected with through you, I was talking to her, and she was telling me about the postcards that her team developed, and she sent me a template. And people are just so willing to give and share, and I think there is that. I suppose it can feel a little bit like you're on an island sometimes. I'd say in all of my roles, I've typically reported through to a HR manager, some kind of HR leadership structure. It sort of feels like sometimes you're by yourself, and I've been in solo contributor roles in L&D and not had a line manager or a team. And so it can feel like you're on your own. So then I think that I've lent a lot into that, just reaching out to people and building connection. And I talk to my team at work about it now, is that just that power in bringing the outside in, because other people they've all got the same problems. I went to an event in Sydney with Charles Jennings a while ago, and so we sat around with people from all of these different industries, all in L&D, common problems, and from organizations that I would have figured they had it all figured out, or but we were all grappling with the same things and all working on the same parts. So yeah, I think it's just a really great, because of some of those pieces, everyone is really willing to connect and learn from each other. I think at our heart, most of us are growth minded, learning focused, and I think can see that in other people.
Absolutely. I think it's not just learning and development, but it does start with us as professionals. And when we think about the ways we're trying to support others to learn and to enable learning in others, that this idea of connecting with others, one of the traps I see people fall into when they want to find out more about how are people learning in my organisation. So you've got learning and development professionals. They're doing the right thing. They're wanting to get out. They're curious. How are people learning? If you ask someone, how have you learnt stuff in the past year? People will say, I did this course, right? So they think immediately, they default to courses. There's something about the word learn that triggers people to think about courses. But if we ask them things like, tell me about a time recently when you solved a problem. How did you solve that problem? Tell me about something you've gotten better at in your work in the past year. What did you do to get better in that work? Experience will come up, practice, getting feedback, but invariably connection to other people will come up, and learning from others, but, tapping into what others know, asking others for support, for help. So I think it's a very human thing to actually, for most of us, to want to connect with others, and it's a very natural thing to connect with others and to find out, as trade examples, find out what other people can show us and share with us. And I think most people are happy to do that if it's approached in the right way.
And even when now people talk about learning on YouTube, like that'll be the other example, right? People go, oh, well, I learned it on YouTube. That is usually learning from someone else. It's just that YouTube is the intermediary between you and another person who's an expert, who's a professional in that field, or playing guitar, whatever the skill is. And they're just explaining and showing you how to do it. So I think sometimes people focus on the tech or the platform in that way, but it's actually, like you say, humans teaching humans is usually the most effective way to do that. And I think one thing, I was talking to someone in my team last week about this, was like, I noticed a pattern of starting to use the word like capability uplift instead of learning. And I've seen people shift from like training to learning, like that was a dirty word, let's move it to learning, let's change that to something else. And saying like they were just getting the same response from their stakeholders. So we're trying to use a different word to get someone to give us a different answer. But when I sort of, broke that down a little bit and talk through it with them to say, stop focusing on like what we're doing, but what we're trying to achieve, and talking about, well, and the example I ended up giving was saying like, to talk to a senior leader to say, can you think of your top performer? Now, would you want more of them? Would you want the people that are, in the middle of your organization to be closer to your top performer? What senior leader is going to say no to that? Yeah. And so by approaching it more from that outcome and taking our language out of these things, I've seen such a better result from conversations at a senior leader level to actually start to talk to them. And I think everyone talks about, well, we need to speak the language of the business. And I still think a lot of people seem to struggle with that. But yeah, that's something I've found, is just being able to get them to think less about the content, less about the course, because like you say, as soon as you mention training, learning, any of those words, they default to build me my course. Here's the slides I want included. And yeah, I think that's one of the things, just trying to break out of that.
Yes, absolutely. I had an example when I was working at Coca-Cola Amatil. That was an amazing period of my own career working at Coca-Cola Amatil. And it's the period from about 2000. I started with them as an external consultant in 2011. In early 2012, I joined as a permanent, and I was with them for around 4 years to 2016. And it's really where I undertook a tremendous shift from thinking like being very training focused. And that was largely as a result of the fact that my early career, the first 16 years of my career, was in the Air Force, working as a logistics officer and on big projects. You know, I was part of a team that introduced the lead-in fighter Hawk to service up at Williamtown at Newcastle. And my scope included, among other things, the training for the air crew, for the maintenance teams. And you can imagine in such a high-stakes safety environment, very, very structured, you know, very careful curriculum design, all programmatic, all courses. And that was, you know, really on top of my own experiences learning through school, through university, and excelling academically. It was really ingrained for me, this training thing and courses. I had to unlearn and relearn a lot of stuff when in that period at Coca-Cola Amatil. It's when I first came across, you know, this idea of 70-20-10, or, you know, learning through other people, learning through experience, and that they were things that we could lean into as learning and development professionals. And it kind of, boom, it opened my world up. And I largely learned about that and explored that through the network, through getting active on Twitter. But fast forward, 2015, I think, the national engineering manager at Coca-Cola Amatil, Damien, came to me and he said, "Look, Michelle, I've got a bit of a problem here. I've got this one really senior engineer, and he's approaching retirement age, and he's been with the company for around 40 years. And whenever we need to know something about how one of our production lines works, or, you know, why we set things up in a certain way, or we've got something that we're having trouble troubleshooting, everybody goes to him. So can you please take one of your team members? We've got 6 months of his time left. Can you allocate one of your team members just to find out everything he knows and document it and turn it into courses?" And I said, well, sure, I could do that. It's a very intense way to do it, though. And do you think that that's really going to answer the problem? I said, I think there might be another way, but I need you to give me a little bit of time to explore what's happening between people in your organisation and what people are doing as they're trying to solve problems, who they're connected to. Now, I didn't get him there on my own. I called in Harold Jarkey, who some people may be familiar with, who I'd met through Twitter, who specialises in something called personal knowledge mastery. And he had examples. He had worked with groups of engineers in the past to connect them into communities of practice, basically. So I got him in to talk engineer to engineer to Damien and to open his mind to some other possibilities. And he agreed to give me some time to explore this. Again, through the network, I reached out to Helen Blunden, who I'm not sure if you ever came across Helen. She's no longer working in learning and development. But she was very big on social learning and communities, and she used to blog a lot, and I understood her work and her approach through her blog. So I invited her to come in and do some analysis with me. We went out to sites, to production sites, and we talked to some of the maintenance engineers to discover what was happening and how they were solving problems. And what was interesting, there were lots of interesting things, but what we found was they were not well connected as a whole. There tended to be one person at each site who had a bit of a network to the other sites, and that was their go-to person. So the knowledge wasn't flowing through people. One thing we did discover, however, was that they were using WhatsApp, which wasn't an official company tech. They were using WhatsApp if things got really hard and they couldn't resolve a problem on a production machine. With the brains trust, the experience they had in the local maintenance team, they would WhatsApp and they would, show live, here's what the machine is doing. Can you hear that sound that it is making? What's going on there? Have you heard this or seen this before? And they were helping each other in that way. So where they could connect, it was super useful. So what we ended up doing instead, we set up a community of practice, and we ran like a series of webinars and gave people practical activities to start connecting with each other, to start sharing what they knew to improve their reach and connection. And that was one of the key ways that we were able to get around this problem of the knowledge isn't flowing through the organisation. So it was there in pockets because different people had worked with this guy, but context matters as well, right? This idea of tacit knowledge, and it's in the moment. So there's an example of connection and how you can kind of lean into connection to help people to solve problems, to get better at their work, which is real learning.
Yeah, I've got some very similar examples, either solved or not solved currently. And there's people in the organization that I work for where I talk to them and asking about, okay, when you get stuck, what do you do? And it's amazed me when I've got answers like, they were part of a course 10 years ago with other people in their same technical engineer space, and that's their network that they've maintained all this time. Now, that's such a good example of what's a real learning, I suppose, event in that way of the networking and connections that can build out. That wouldn't be part of the agenda, wouldn't be part of the learning outcomes, but this network that they've created has been maintained through the years. And when I see those examples, I always say, how do we make sure, how can we amplify those, not stomp all over them, not try and put too much structure around them, but help other connections, because new people come into the business and they don't have that same opportunity. But I think sometimes that's not seen, from a leadership perspective, because they go, oh, well, it's been working for so long. Everyone, we know that people talk, they've got connections there. It's like, but what about the new people? What about the people that are moving up? And how do they actually create the same network? And that's one of the things that, when I was sort of thinking about the podcast, it's like, there's so many amazing podcasts out there, right? Like yours included, but there's so many other ones out there. And I was like, well, why should I even start one, right? But it's like I'm still really surprised whenever I mention your name, in people in my team out, here have never heard of you, right? And so I go, okay, well, there's more reason to do the same, introduce more people, create more of a network. The more people talking about what it is we're doing, the more people, introducing new people into the sphere. I think it, just creates that bigger network for us to get better, and I suppose ultimately change more people from that shift from sort of training focus to, solving real problems at the end of the day. You said before that was like a big boom moment for you. What was it, a single moment, or was it iterative over time that changed?
There was a moment that I think started the shift, and then there were lots of little moments that accumulated. I started going to industry conferences in around 2011. And over the course of a year, one of the speakers would invariably ask at one of these conferences, put your hand up if you're on Twitter. Now, I had opened a Twitter account in 2009, but I had hardly used it because I couldn't figure it out. Like, how do I get value out of this? I do not get it. Twitter is different now, but then it was kind of in its heyday. And I went, I was at this one conference and a guy named Rob Wilkins was speaking. And the same thing, put your hand up if you're on Twitter. And he said, if you are not using Twitter, you are missing a massive networking and professional development opportunity if you are in learning and development. So I went and spoke to him afterwards and I said, Rob, I don't know how to get started. How do I use this beast? How do I make sense out of it? He showed me a couple of things, but what he did was he said, look, Jane Hart from the Modern Workplace Learning Centre actually runs these social learning courses that you can do. Why don't you take a look at that? So I enrolled in her social learning practitioner program. Now, it doesn't exist anymore, which is a real pity because it was amazing. And it wasn't really a course. It was, an experiential learning experience, really. You did it as, you signed up as a cohort, but there were no lessons. Each week you got a different challenge. So there were 25 challenges, one a week. And the first challenge was to set up a blog. Okay, I don't know what I'm going to write about, but I'll set up a blog. But she solved that the second week. The second week's challenge was to blog about setting up a blog, which was a little bit meta. So I did that. And then the third week it was to join a Twitter chat. which was I think they're still run, a real-time chat where people use a hashtag to join a stream of conversation for an hour with other people all around the world on a topic, and they were facilitated lightly. Someone would be the chair, pick a topic, have some questions, inject some questions. And joining those Twitter chats was incredible, because all of a sudden I was sitting there having conversations, yes, in this strange kind of space initially, with the likes of, Laura Overton. It's how I met Charles Jennings, Clark Quinn in the US, Jane Bozarth, whose work on social learning has so influenced my own work and working out loud. And I think it was at that point, so I think Rob's urging, joining Jane Hart's social learning practitioner program, and then starting to get onto Twitter chats and expanding my network, it just exposed me to so many new to me ideas. And people were very willing after those chats to connect with me. So Laura Overton was someone who I met on Twitter. She was talking about benchmarking, which of course she set up and ran a global L&D benchmark for around 15 years before selling it to Mind Tools for Business, who still run it today as the Learning Performance Benchmark. Incredible body of research. But I met Laura on a Twitter chat, and I followed up and arranged to have a conversation with her. And over time, some of these connections deepen, and you end up doing things with these people, right? You end up collaborating. My collaboration with Laura continues to this day. It's kind of built. It really deepened during the pandemic when we teamed up with another lady from the US, the Learning Rebel, Shannon Tipton, and ran what we called the Emerging Stronger program, which was like, it was more a movement, I guess. It started as a process of inquiry. How do we emerge stronger from the pandemic in L&D? Then before going into it, we gained insights. We ran a couple of years worth of masterclasses, which were very much action learning in a community setting. But that only happened because I started getting active on Twitter and just reached out and used the connection. And as you say, people are very willing, as a general rule, particularly if they're in the public domain, they're putting themselves out there. Mostly they're willing to have a conversation at the very least. And serendipity, you just don't know where these things lead. That's the power of the network, and showing up, being generous and contributing in the network. And with that whole growth mindset thing, it's John Stepper's working out loud philosophy. Like, my world just exploded at that point around 2014, 2015, when I started getting active and making connections outside of my own organisation. And it's like, wow, there's so much more to this learning thing than training. It was incredible.
That's I think mine was on the sort of transition from the last company I worked for into this one. I had a slight diversion into I won't tell the full story, but ended up building a mobile app for teen sort of high school age kids. And as part of that, we used design thinking, or the sprint methodology. I'd never been exposed to that, but I was working with an app development company, and that was how they did things. And I went through that process and went out like that. That was my first big, I think, explosion of like thinking about things differently. And so I remember coming into the company I work for now and trying to then apply the sprint methodology to my first big project. And I got absolutely railroaded by my stakeholders. Tried to talk to the people that were focusing on, got told, no, they're too busy. Don't talk to them. I know the answers. And that project ended up being, I still think it's good work, but it has sat in a SharePoint in a cold, dark cave ever since, because we didn't really understand the needs of the learners properly. So I think off the back of that as well, that was sort of oh, wait, I wanted to take that approach. I didn't get the support for it. And then I saw what happened to it, and I went, I don't want that to happen again. I don't want like good work, good money to go to waste. And so I think that was then probably the first big piece now that made me go, okay, I need to have a different approach, and really advocate in that case for what I knew was the right thing, rather than just going. And I was only 2 months into the company, so I kind of went, okay, yep, I'll do what I'm told, but go, okay, such a waste of everyone's time and energy. So yeah, I think that's
why do you think you got why did you get pushback on taking that kind of human-centered approach? I imagine you wanted to spend some time talking to people, having a look at what they were doing, exploring ideas with them.
Yeah, I think that, look, people, obviously, what's the right way to say this? people have their own agendas. I'll say that. Maybe that's the first part, right? Like, it was someone in a corporate HR structure that, and not through any kind of malice, I don't think, but thought they knew what they needed. And they had probably an objective in their goals and their performance outcomes to build a certain solution that they'd already committed to for this audience group. So I think then probably, and maybe a mixture of me being new into the company, coming in and saying, okay, that's great, you want that, but can I go talk to these people? Probably some elements. I probably hadn't built the trust and credibility with that person at that point, is probably the thing now if I think back. So I think that, but, like I said, they just kept saying they're too busy, they don't have the time. And, it's funny now, a little bit full circle, almost 6 years later, I'm actually now kind of solving that need for that same group, but going through it properly. So it's just taken a little while for the cycle to come back around. But yeah, I think, look, if I'm blunt about it, there's a lot of egos in the corporate world. I know you've dipped in and out of it, but I think sometimes there is, I said, not through any malice, but there's people that are trying to do what they think the right thing is for whatever reason. And I think, unfortunately, if they aren't willing to sort of, be open to, maybe they don't have all the answers, that can lead to the wrong path.
There's a few biases, like cognitive biases. Well, cognitive biases, as well as this really natural human bias to action. We want to get on, we want to solve problems, we want to deliver things, and that recognition that the quality and the degree to which we, solve problems and make an impact can be substantially influenced by taking a little more time up front to make sure we've understood the problem and the needs really well. I suspect, in the past 6 years, Agile as an approach has become more commonplace and better understood, and more people have been exposed to it. And whilst Agile, I think it's kind of nice that it moves you into action quicker and allows you to test and iterate. Potentially that's one way of trying to breach this tension that exists with this bias to action and wanting to do a good job. But the other thing is, cognitive biases for us every time. So there's, when I was working on this Emerging Stronger initiative with Shannon and Laura, we started by doing a series of podcast interviews, and we spoke with somewhere around 40 L&D leaders from around the world. A handful of business leaders joined us, and we were exploring this question by leaning into examples of things that people had done when the pandemic hit, and how the work they'd done prior to the pandemic positioned them with approaches and ways of adapting. And we were leaning into this question of how can we emerge stronger in L&D out of the pandemic than we went into it, because so much shifted so quickly. It's like, let's not go backwards at the end of this. Out of that, we analyse, like, what do we see? What are the patterns? What are the trends? Nowadays, you'd use AI to help you with that, but we did it the old-fashioned way, just with human brain power. And interestingly, Laura Overton in particular has an incredible brain for pattern making and connecting the dots across things. And we came up with these we called them lenses, or ways of seeing things, seeing problems, seeing opportunities, seeing the world, and making sense of it, and crafting solutions and implementing them. That kind of we saw across all these examples. And one of those was the community lens. We then wrote a white paper about what we saw and what approaches might work, and then we developed these masterclasses which we ran to test out these lenses and enhance and improve upon them. But I jumped on the community lens and said I want to do the work on that one to shape that one up. And as part of that, I asked myself the question, why is this what is the community lens? And it's really opening ourselves up to perspectives and input of others to understand and solve problems and do things that make a difference, in a nutshell. It's like, why is that important? And one of the pieces of background information I found was this codex of cognitive biases, and identified over 180 different biases that are lying out there to trap us, and our assumptions get in the way all the time. And I came across a podcast, Daniel Kahneman, very Nobel Prize winning laureate for some of his work around there was one specific bias, I can't remember which one, that kind of kicked off a lot of his work, and he was recognized for. But He was being interviewed by, let me get this right, Shane Parrish on the Knowledge Project. And one of the things Shane asked him is, well, if we're aware of all these biases, is that enough to overcome them? And he just laughed and he said, it's far from enough to overcome them. It's like it's really, 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 really hard to overcome them. And the only way we have a hope of overcoming them is good quality thinking with others using structured thinking processes. And I think that's why things like these sprints, the human-centered design thinking, really are helpful to kind of peel back our assumptions and open us up to different perspectives.
There's two things that come to mind for me. It's that I've been getting fairly immersed in some of Guy Wallace's stuff lately, and something I really liked that he was talking about is just why he uses the language master performer versus SME. He said because he got burnt too many times for asking for an SME and getting someone who hadn't actually done the job for a long, long time. And we have that all the time, right? Where there's the people that learned how to do the job 20 years ago, they're classified as an SME, and it's really hard for them to break their bias or their, view of how does a new person learn this? Not what do they need to, what's my perspective of what they need to know? Because you ask a knowledge expert SME what someone needs to know, and they'll say, well, all of this is important versus what does the actual new person need to know? And then second thing that came to mind was the Curious Advantage podcast, Simon Brown's and Garrick's podcast. They did one on leadership. It was quite a while ago now. I'll put it in the show notes, but I've shared it with a fair few people. And they were talking about as you progress up through leadership roles into more senior roles, the level of your risk, you become more and more risk averse because you feel like you've seen it before, you've stopped the thing going wrong before. So you start leaning into, well, I've made these decisions. That's how it got me to here. So it just builds a stronger and stronger bias, and you become less willing to listen to people as you progress through leadership levels. So that was one that when I heard that, I'm like, it explained a lot to me, I think, in a lot of ways, and probably just, put some of those things on my radar of, the longer you've been doing something, there is that bias towards, well, I know what to do here, and less likely to listen to people that are, new to it or new perspectives and different perspectives. So, I think they're maybe two of the traps that I've seen and had to work with before.
I think I think you're right that our experience shapes how we see things. So the more experience we've had, potentially the more closed some of our thinking becomes. And we have to ask the question if we're trying to, because often in learning and development, we're trying to, build a case for change, trying to get approval and buy-in to do something different, something that we think might work better, or even in your case, that example you just gave, just to spend some time exploring and asking the questions and finding out what's really happening for people and what really matters to them and what might be really useful to them, rather than thinking, we know the answers. What works, what gets through to people like that. And what I'm seeing and hearing a lot is data. And data comes in many forms. It can come in the form of quantitative data. It can come in the form of just doing a few little tests, experiments under the radar. Don't call them pilots. As soon as you call it a pilot, you've got a project. Just try something and see what happens. Or in the case of this master performer idea, I think that's a fantastic idea. If you can find a way to go away and look at top performers and what are they doing, and understand what they are doing, and to be able to present that back, and also understand how did they get better. And it's probably not that they've done better people. There's probably other things they've done to get better. And examples from elsewhere are good quality data as well. Sometimes it's a matter of asking senior leaders, what other organisations do you admire for their performance or for the approaches they've taken to improving performance, to innovation. Again, not to learning, to innovation, to increasing their market share, their competitive advantage, and where does that come from? And if they don't know enough about how that's happened, you can go away. You know that they pay attention to those organisations. Find out whatever you can about how development happens in those organisations and bring that back to them. So I think you have to do your work to think about what shapes people's views and to create the case for change. And there's nothing like data and examples to help people to see what's really going on.
And that's like the the learning business partners in my team. When I work with them, I talk to them about that of like, don't just, if you bring stories and examples of like, this is what other companies like us are doing. This is where I've seen people's success, like, and the value of, I'll say again, like your podcast, right? Of like, some of those stories are not our industry, not our problems, but I always, everything, in every episode, there's something that I go, I think that could apply here, or it sometimes it will go in the back of my brain, and I won't think about it for 6 months until I go, I think Michelle had a podcast on this issue, and I'll go back and find it in that way. So yeah, I think that sort of outside in, and something else I always talk about that I know you've mentioned is that go to Gemba, go to where it's happening, go to the source, go and understand and watch and see how it's actually happening, because you won't get it from a procedure. You won't get it from the SME. Go and talk to those people that are on the ground doing it every day. And if they're taking a shortcut, be curious, understand why, and I think where you'll find, because humans are humans at the end of the day, and they will find the most efficient way to do things, and the way that they perceive is the most effective way to do things. And yeah, I think without that view on it, we're not going to be successful in what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, they'll do what works for them, right? So there's a great example. David Broadhurst from a company called CodeSafe and Ray Gretsch from an installation company came on the podcast. And it was there'd been a period where the Australian government was giving all these subsidies for ceiling insulation. And it led to some poor practices in the industry and some deaths actually in the industry. And they spoke about going out, like wanting to improve how the safe working practices of their people who are involved in ceiling insulation. They had a lot of people who couldn't speak English, or English was an acquired language, and they were asking them to read processes and sign them off. Say, yeah, I understand this process, I can follow this process. And so they were signing them off. But, did they actually understand them? It's very different reading a document to actually being in a physical space and trying to do something. And this is all physical work. So they went out to video them doing things, to make videos to replace the written processes. And in the process of going out to real locations and videoing people trying to do the process, and even if they asked them, they've walked them through the process, now the process says do this next. These guys are going, I can't. Like, I physically cannot do this thing that you've just asked me to do, because this ladder versus the height of the ceiling and the size of the entry into the roof, I physically cannot do this. So, they were coming across problems like equipment needed to be replaced, things like this. And there is just nothing like connecting with the people who are doing the work and going out and seeing it for yourself. And that's another example of connection in a different way. It's not just about us connecting with each other, but just getting a real sense of the ground of reality of what the people in our organisation are trying to do. Nigel Payne calls it doing the field work. I've got a conversation coming up with him on that. I think that's so important. And I know it can be hard in the hybrid environment. It's probably created more barriers because it's just easy to jump on a call and talk to people. Physically going and seeing and talking to people, so valuable.
Yeah, that's like the company I'm in. It's very hard to get to some of our locations and things like that. But and I've been here now 6.5 years, and I've got a really good network in that way that there's supervisors I can reach out to. There's like you can actually still jump on a call with some of these people and just say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. This is the what tell me about your reality. Tell me what's going on. So I think all of those are skills as well, right? Of like building internal network collaboration, connection.
Yeah. There's something that's really important. Circling back to this idea of some of the stuff that I did through that Emerging Stronger initiative. When the pandemic hit, do you remember how we all started going to webinars? How we were going anywhere we could to talk to other people and go, what's happening in your organisation? How are you helping your people? What are you doing? We were just so thirsty because we were navigating new territory and we didn't necessarily know the answers, although the seeds of a lot of the answers were out there already. And it was just, there was this big catch up and figuring out how to adjust and what to do differently. I did a podcast interview, which will be out in what is it today? It's the 21st of May. It'll be out in early June 2024. Don Taylor and Egla Veritzlake. I'm sorry if I've got her surname wrong. It's a very hard name to pronounce. Recently put out a report, AI in Action, which is case studies. What are people actually using AI for in L&D now, and a number of the case studies. And there's a really interesting observation about the fact that we've leaned into content creation first. Because it's an obvious use case and it improves our efficiency. Hopefully, if we use it well, it can improve the quality, but that's not always the case. But the other thing is it's also something that we can do on our own within L&D. We don't need to collaborate with others to do it. But the higher value opportunities that they're seeing, and some of the stuff that's being done in some organisations to really look at how can we use AI more effectively for things like performance support, for skill building and practice, for skills management, that requires collaboration. So whilst we're grappling with this new thing, which is, there's so much potential. It's not just a single purpose tech. It's this ubiquitous tech that you can do so much with, and we haven't even tapped the surface of it. The key to us exploring that is building relationships and collaborating with other people. And they give a really good example from Ericsson, with the head of technology and innovation, has set up this community-driven approach. So I think whenever we've got to do this credible sense making and figure out, there's this disruption and there's always something going on. Whenever we're leaning into these new spaces, the only way to do it is through collaboration to really make the most of opportunities.
And I've done a couple of speaking things on AI and L&D, and the question on, I think every time I've done that has been like, what's going to change? Like what is it that this is going to shift? And my answer is always everything.
Yeah,
right?
It's not going to change. Yeah.
Going to change. And there's not a single answer that I could have given. What was it now? Nearly a year and a half ago, November 2022 or whenever it was that ChatGPT kind of hit the headlines. I remember at the time I was prepping for a sort of leaders forum that Liberate Learning had put together. In the sort of 3 months or 2 months leading up to when I was going to present, I changed my presentation so many times because the tech kept evolving. And I kept updating, going, okay, that's it. Now a new version would come out where it could do something different. And it ended up look, like there's no point in me saying this is the answer, because it's just the evolution is so crazy. Like I'm now subscribed to a few different mailing lists of like daily AI news, and it's like there's huge things happening every day, new models, new audio generation, new video generation, like all of these different things that you can't sit on the sidelines. And I know for a long time, and even back to the data thing as well, there's these skills that I think people before you could afford to say, well, I'm not a technology person or I'm not a data person. Now, like I don't believe that we can sit by and say, well, I don't do that, right? Because it has to become part of our days. And one of the things around the content generation I've been talking about is like, we have to start thinking about what the world of L&D, what the job is, what the profession is. You take out content development. Because yesterday there was a tool I was playing with that within a matter of minutes, I built 6 very quick modules for a particular subject, because I'm putting forward a few options on a basically no cost, quick, how can we solve this fast option, through to a more sort of deeper skills-based approach and sort of putting together a few options. And so I just wanted to see, okay, how quick can I build something? And it was literally minutes. And I'd built modules enough that an SME could review them, give some input, and it would be done. Now, how long before those tools are in everybody's hands? So what's our role in that? And I think that's...
And how much risk is there around really poor quality content that doesn't hit the mark with learning going out? Because there's some things that endure in this world of AI. So yes, everything's changing, but everything's changing in terms of how we might go about, getting support. The tech enablement that we're using to support learning is changing. The way people learn, the fundamentals of how the human brain functions is not changing. The fundamental principles of good learning design, things like spaced repetition, practice in the real world context, that's not changing. So it becomes even more critical to bring that lens of the expertise around what good learning looks like and how we can enable learning, and always start with the problem or opportunity or need. Don't start with the tech, and you're talking about, here's a particular problem I was trying to solve. And the other thing is we still need to work with others to bring these things to life. So collaboration and building relationships. So I think with any big shift, it's always important to ask not only what's changing, but what's staying the same and what's enduring, and what do we still bring to the picture. There's still lots there.
And that's there was something I heard on a podcast not long ago that about we're really good as humans in predicting what won't, when it comes to technology, what won't be there in the future, identifying redundancies, but not actually know what will happen. So we can say, oh, well, building content, like just, being able to pump out a quick e-learning in a second. It's like that's going to be non-existent, right? At some point, it'll be all chatbots, it'll be AI interfaces. There won't be the need to sit down and do an hour-long e-learning course, because the shift towards, content, like sort of performance support, more, those approaches.
Performance support is a huge opportunity, particularly as we figure out how to use AI to tap into our organization, our documented organizational knowledge, how to curate knowledge from, places where people are having conversations and interacting. But then we've got this challenge we need to figure out, and we will, around the quality of that, and is it the right stuff, without weighing down and stopping it happening. So there's some challenges with it, and I think there'll be ways of solving these problems that we've been grappling with that are beyond our imagination at the moment, as you say.
We've already got some internally examples in the company I'm with where I've heard it referenced that basically for one of our products, the AI bot that they've trained on that is now the most knowledgeable, I'll say, person, entity, thing on that particular product. There is nobody that knows more about a particular area, because they've built it off the whole knowledge base of everything that exists, and then had the SMEs in the business training it, refining it, and building the structure around it. And now they're saying it knows more than anyone. And then there's internally where they build essentially the same type of thing, but just for commercial product knowledge. So value propositions, understanding products, all of these different things, like those things already exist now, right? So it's like you take that out 3 years, 5 years, however long, it's the dumbest it will ever be right now, and it's only going to get better and stronger. So I think back to the if you just see your role as like developing content, being the order taker, I think it's really short-lived, right? And it's like
you'll be redundant pretty quickly. Yes.
So it's like, okay, what are those things where, the performance consulting approach is really getting in, understanding the business, being able to understand, well, I know you say this is your challenge, but it's actually this, like those human skills that AI can't really do now.
I reckon AI will get there, though.
It will. Yeah.
And we can already use AI to help us with that kind of inquiry. There's a really interesting example from a company called Leighton, a consulting company, which is in Don Taylor and Egler's report on AI in action, where they were seeking to improve client retention, and they used AI tools to unpack what you called their master performers, what the top performers were doing, and converted that into, well, here's the skills or here's the practices. And then they were able to turn that into source material to use for real-time call monitoring and feedback. And they've got the data that shows the improvement in their customer retention as a result of using the AI in these ways. And, that coaching feedback, that real-time feedback, that's performance support, right? But then also understanding the problem. And I think we'll get better at figuring out how to use the tools. It's not like we can sit here and wait and it's like, oh, an AI tool will come along and knock on our door and solve the problem. We've got to get in there and experiment and figure it out. But there's so much coming our way. It's incredible.
When I did the talk, one of the first ones I did on AI, I actually told that group that I taught ChatGPT at the time. I told it that I wanted it to basically be virtual you and Charles Jennings, and give me both of your perspectives on particular topics. And because you've got a body of work, and so does he, it could easily do that, right? And there's another guy, Brandon Carson, I think.
Brandon Carson, from the US.
Yeah, so I don't know whether you've seen his ChatGPT bot. I know Ross Stevenson's the same. So you can easily go into ChatGPT now, you could train Michelle GPT on all of your transcripts.
I actually have created Learning Uncut GPT where I've uploaded my transcripts and I'm using them to do some research at the moment. Yeah, but the kind of ask anything of any guest that's, if it's been said on a Learning Uncut podcast, you can draw on it. Yeah.
And it's quite easy to do now. Like anyone listening to this can go to ChatGPT, set up a GPT, and I've built my own model already where I've asked it to think about 70-20-10 performance consulting methodology, like a few of those things, and to basically get it to be a virtual performance consultant.
Right.
And either two different tasks that I've used it for is to either say, if I give it data, I want it to help me on where the gaps are, on what other questions I should be asking, or I've sort of also played around with getting it to, if I don't actually know what questions to ask, to kind of be the coach to me, to say, here's the first questions, get these inputs. I was just playing around with different ways that someone, new or maybe not, that hasn't quite got the performance consulting skill yet, could have it in the background and help them through a performance consulting conversation to be like, okay, here's the kind of themes and questions you want to explore, and put your inputs in. And it's pretty impressive.
So have you had to upload anything to give it a knowledge base, or have you just told it what it's an expert in?
Yeah, you just tell. Yeah, I've told it. Like,
it just saved me reworking the same prompts over and over in general Chat GPT.
When I usually talk about like prompt engineering, because that's kind of the technical term, is like I think there's probably now more technical words, but I kind of refer to it as like building prompts, where it's like I think that's the art of actually prompting AI, because a lot of people I think are still conditioned in the way to use it the same as we use Google.
Yeah.
You ask a question, it gives a response.
Yeah.
But because you can stack prompts on top of each other and say, okay, like, you can ask it a question and say, okay, now what would your answer to that be if you use the 70-20-10 methodology?
Yeah.
And then, you can keep building ideas, and you can say, how would Michelle Ockers answer this question based on
You're doing me out of business here, Greg. But it's real, right? People can do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, and that's, I think anyone, like, build one that people can ask, right? Because I think that's, in a lot of ways, where, like you say, the most helpful version of that is someone wanting to reference all of your body of work on your podcast to say, where has this been discussed? Is in this episode. Here it is. Go to, timestamp, whatever. So, yeah, it's pretty impressive. Once you learn how to, I'll say, manipulate it in that way, is to be able to pull in, even books and different things like that. Now it's got such quick access to the internet. You can say, okay, from this book, use this resource. Now, collate ideas, in this way. So
you just have to make some time. We have to go in with, here's something I'm working on, or something I want answers to. How might I, play around with the tool to get some support?
Yeah, another really cool tool, Perplexity. Have you seen it?
No.
Perplexity.ai.
Yeah.
Ross Stevenson sent it to me. I stumbled across it around the same time, but I think Ross first mentioned it to me, and then I heard the CEO on a podcast, I think within the same days. It was on Freakonomics, I think. It's much more transparent in its references.
Right.
And it also suggests follow-up questions, which are quite cool. So it will, after a response, say, here's some potential follow-up questions, and here's the reference article. So it'll give you all the links to, whatever, wherever it's pulled the data from, so you can go and do more reading on it. Whereas I know ChatGPT, they've started to introduce some referencing, because to start with, you didn't really know where it was pulling stuff from, and people talk about AI hallucinations. Perplexity's been a pretty cool and interesting tool, particularly when you're doing research. So
yeah, I'll take a look at it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good. Well,
so much out there. Well, that's interesting. We started with connection and collaboration, and we ended up with AI, but AI helping us to connect and collaborate, right? And to solve problems better.
Very good. Anything else you want to cover off?
How much longer have we got? No, it's been lovely coming on and just having a kind of a casual conversation and seeing where it leads us, starting with an idea. So, no, I'm excited to keep leaning into the community and also to take a look at a couple of new things with AI, Greg. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your time.
And who else are you hoping to talk to, or what other kind of topics are you hoping to explore on the podcast?
back to you saying about Twitter, and being almost surprised at how willing people are to give their time. I've asked a few people that I was like, "There's no way." Like, I've just started this thing, and I've
Yep.
been really impressed by like the people who are like, "Yeah, sure, just let me know when." So yeah, I've got a couple of cool people that I'm pretty excited about. So I haven't got. I was just trying to schedule in someone before, but they're in US East time zone. So that's the hard thing, is just trying to find time zones and things that match up.
UK's
But
harder right now. We end up
yeah,
doing nighttime stuff for the UK. Yeah.
I afternoon late night calls anyway, but yeah, there are a few people that have got books that I've either been reading or I've got in my bookshelf behind me that I'm keen to have on. So yeah,
Great.
I think trying to figure out I'll say the structure and how often I have guests and how long I sit here and talk to myself. It's definitely more fun talking to someone. So we'll see.
I agree. It's easier too. It's hard just to talk to yourself. I think you said that in your first episode.
Very
All right.
Thanks.
And hopefully I'll see you around the traps. I think you're going to the L&D symposium.
Yeah, in June.
Yeah, I will see you there. Looking forward to that, talking about connection.
Definitely. Should be good.
Okay.
All right, I'll see you. Thanks for showing.
Thanks for having me.